So welcome to our first CCCW seminar this term. I'm very excited about the program that we've been able to put together this Lent term of 3 seminars for the Cambridge Center of World Christianity. The center actually had its 25th anniversary last week, I should have said, and we had a celebratory event yesterday. And for those of you who don't know the center, it's a fascinating hub in Cambridge that sits at the intersection between the Faculty of Theology and so the broader public. So it's a research center, and it connects with the faculty. I'm a lecturer in World Christianities at the faculty, and Dr. Muthurej Swami, who's also in this call, is the director of the center, and we together put these seminars on and host them together. And today it's my special pleasure to welcome Dr. Anna Kirchner from Heidelberg, or she's zooming into us from Stuttgart, I believe. Dr. Kirchner just recently completed her PhD in Heidelberg on Arab evangelicals in Israel. She studied Islamic studies and evangelical theology in a double course, so not a combination bachelor master's, but actually two study courses in parallel, which is quite a load. And then she stayed in Heidelberg to do her PhD on these Arab evangelicals after spending some time in Israel, Palestine during her studies as well. I met her when I was just beginning my postdoctoral work. We were taking an Arabic course together. I worked on German, East Africa, and Islam, and I thought it might be good to learn Arabic. I have to admit that Anna took Arabic a lot further, whereas I'm sitting here looking at old manuscripts and comparing texts, but I couldn't say a word in Arabic. She actually learned to use the language and do proper field work among Arab evangelicals in Israel. And as you've seen from the announcement and the abstract, this is an extremely interesting topic because there's so many identities that intersect and cross. And it's actually sort of a portion of the population that is that often often flies under the radar, I should say, of sort of ecumenical discussions about Israel, Palestine, and Islam, Judaism, and Christianity in the region. So without further ado, we're very much looking forward to your talk, and welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much. I will first start sharing my screen and hope it works.
Excellent, we can see everything.
Okay, wait, I have to minimize and shift this one. So, great. Thank you for the warm and kind introduction, Jörg. I'm very happy to present my paper on Arab evangelicals in Israel, Identity and Conflict today. 1 second, I shift again these windows and then I'll continue. Great. So let's get started. I'm an Israeli, but not a Jew. I'm an Arab, I'm a Palestinian, but not a Muslim. I'm a Christian, not traditional Christian. I'm an evangelical. This self-introduction of an Arab evangelical from Nazareth shows the multi-layered, complex, and conflictory identity of Arab evangelicals in Israel. What becomes clear is the desire to fit into standard categories and yet not being able to do so. He is neither a Jewish Israeli, nor a Muslim Palestinian, nor a traditional Christian. With this understanding of himself, he comes up against the limits of common, socially expected categories. Nevertheless, he can also classify himself. He is Israeli, Arab, Palestinian, Christian, and evangelical. He unites seemingly contradictory things, but the different self-understandings are in tension with each other. This categorization is often located in a minority discourse. For example, Arab evangelicals in Israel are a small minority. In fact, it is more accurate to say that they are a minority within a minority within a minority. As Arabs, they form 20.6% of the whole population of Israel. As Christians, they constitute only 10% of the Arabs in Israel, numbering around 160,000 individuals. As evangelicals, the number is no more than 5,000. I personally think that this conceptualization does not help. Rather, I would argue that the identity conflict of Arab evangelicals in Israel points to a fundamental problem, to the categories themselves that are otherwise rarely questioned. In other words, it is not the Arab evangelicals who do not fit the categories, but the categories themselves do not fit. The categories themselves have been used so many times and in so many different contexts that they are hardly questioned in terms of their concrete meaning. Thus, Arab evangelical identity unfolds a critical potential regarding national and religious identity in Israel in general. So, what is the identity conflict among Arab evangelicals in Israel? In my opinion, the identity conflict of Arab evangelicals in Israel can be described along two broad lines. On the one hand, there is a tension between evangelical and Christian, and on the other hand, there is a tension between evangelical and the national identity, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, or alternatives. I would like to illustrate these two main conflict lines using the example of the picture you might have already seen on the poster. We see a boy on a donkey, children standing around. I took this picture during a Palm Sunday procession of a Baptist school class. The teachers wanted to reenact the biblical story to remind the children of what Palm Sunday is all about. Similar events took place, for example, at the Nazareth Village and Evangelical Open Air Museum. This is in contrast to Orthodox or Catholic churches that have scout troops marching with brass bands. Orthodox and Catholic processions take place on every single church holiday, and there are a lot of them, but they hardly vary. What in this example looks like a simple theological dispute between biblical claim, focus on Jesus on the one hand, and seemingly contentless tradition, actually goes much deeper. This is due to the specific understanding of religion and Christianity in Israel, which I will explain later in detail. In short, the contextual peculiarity is that religious communities in Israel are responsible for personal status law and family law. Although there are secular alternatives in some cases, marriage and divorce are only possible within a recognized religious community. Until today, there is no civil marriage in Israel. The evangelicals, however, are not recognized, and this presents them with immense problems and conflicts. The study of Arab evangelical identity thus leads to a critical questioning of the understanding of religion and Christianity in Israel in general. The portrayed Palm Sunday event of this Baptist school class also gave rise to a discussion about the relation of religious and national identity. A heated discussion developed between parents and observers on social media. The Baptists were attacked and urged to rather teach the children Palestinian history and culture and not to tell so much Christian nonsense. One mother told me about this discussion, claiming that we can be both. We can be pro-Palestinians, talk about our Palestinian history and faith, and be evangelical. Needless to say, no one took offense at the Orthodox or Catholic processions. They are, so to speak, a cultural matter. But if you take a closer look at the two different processions, it's all the more interesting. As we can see, the scout group wears an Israeli flag on its uniform, expressing the present reality. The group of Arab Christians is Israeli. The boy on the donkey, on the other hand, wears the kufiyeh, the symbol of the Palestinian liberation struggle par excellence. He expresses by wearing it, "I'm a Palestinian," and of course he holds Israeli citizenship as well. And the meaning of this could even be, Jesus is a Palestinian. With this in mind, the accusation that evangelicals are not interested in Palestinian identity is in need of explanation. At first, it can be explained by the fact that religious, in the sense of pious, is often understood as apolitical. Furthermore, because of the Zionist orientation of global evangelicalism, Arab evangelicals are often seen locally as Zionists or traitors. The debate about the Arabs' own national self-understanding in Israel between Arab, Palestinian, Israeli alternatives is made more difficult and complicated for evangelicals by Christian evangelical Zionism, most prominently in the US. In my further presentation, I would like to address these just outlined conflict lines, evangelical and Christian, as well as evangelical and Arab, Israeli, Palestinian in more details. First, however, I would like to explain what and who I mean by Arab evangelicals. In 2005, the Association of Baptist Churches, Church of the Nazarene, Assemblies of God, Brethren, as well as several parachurch institutions, united as the Convention of Evangelical Churches in Israel. I will refer to it as CECI, or Arab Convention or Simple Convention. Today, around 32 Arab churches with an estimated 5,000 members belong to the convention in Israel. Most of them are located in the north of Israel. Nazareth can be seen as a center. I suggest that evangelicalism among Arab Christians in Israel emerged with the naming of the convention as Evangelical. Let me look back into history a bit to explain my thesis, the meaning of the name Evangelical, and the lines of conflict that arise from it. Although the denominations just mentioned had existed in Israel since the beginning or middle of the 20th century, they did not share a common understanding as evangelicals. They saw themselves more as Baptists, Nazarenes, etc. It was not until the 1990s that the withdrawal of mostly US American missionaries brought about an Arabization and certain independence that was accompanied by a charismatization. Thus, Baptists, Assemblies of God, etc., strengthened their contact with one another, and a common understanding emerged that came to be named as Evangelical. It finally resulted in the funding of the convention in 2005. With this convention, its members want to distinguish themselves from the Anglicans on the one hand, and from the Evangelical Association in Israel, short EAI, on the other. With both groups, the Anglicans and the EAI, the convention competes for the hegemony to name and determine the meaning of evangelical. Let me go first into the interaction between the convention and the Anglicans. Since their emergence in Palestine and Israel in the 19th century, the Anglicans have had a self-understanding as evangelicals. In recent times, however, such a self-understanding has been rejected outwardly, preferring names such as Protestant or simply Anglican. This is due to the fact that the convention claims evangelical for itself. Leading members of the convention are clear in their view of the Anglicans. I quote, "The general opinion among the members of the CECI is that the clergy of this church, meaning the Anglican Church, are liberal rather than evangelical," unquote. According to the leading members of the convention, evangelical means, and I quote again, a personal faith in the redemption wrought by the cross resulting in new birth, coupled with the desire to share this faith with others. There is also mention of the centrality of scripture and a free style of worship, unquote. Despite the claimed clear possibility of distinction, there are of course numerous overlaps and common features. Nevertheless, the members of the convention clearly distinguish themselves from the Anglicans. This becomes especially clear when we take a closer look at the funding goal of the convention. For the goal of the convention was not only to have common fellowship, but above all to be officially recognized as a religious community in Israel and thus, among other things, to have the possibility of marrying and divorcing. There have been considerations to join the Anglicans as a subgroup. The Anglicans have had an officially recognized status since 1980, but the convention deliberately decided against it, fearing for its own profile to be tarnished in the process. Let me now come to the other evangelical group, the EAI, the Evangelical Association in Israel. With the founding of the convention, there was also a break with the EAI, which at that time was still called United Christian Council in Israel, UCCI. This council was founded in 1955 as an umbrella organization for predominantly missionary organizations. Most of the Arab churches that later formed the Arab Convention were also members, but they felt unrepresented there as local believers. This misbalance led to the funding of the Arab Convention in 2005. The non-Arab members of the UCCI could not understand the Arabs striving for recognition. To put it bluntly, they did not want to turn their Christian faith communities into religious courts. The result was a rift that had already been brewing in the years before. The UCCI did not rename itself EAI until 2009, 4 years after the Arab Convention was founded, highlighting its claim to be evangelical. Evangelical also serves as a name by which the convention hopes to benefit from and participate in global networks such as the World Evangelical Alliance, WEA, and raise support for their cause. Yet this partnership is limited due to two reasons, which then also lead us to the two central lines of the identity conflict of Arab evangelicals in Israel I have already described in the introduction. First, the Arab evangelicals striving for recognition does not meet broad acceptance and appreciation in the global evangelical discourse, because such a legal body is not compatible with genuine evangelical interests such as personal faith, free style of worship, and so on. Second, the Zionist orientation of global evangelicalism does not, to put it mildly, welcome Arab evangelicals. Both aspects are directly mirrored to Arab evangelicals through the EAI. The EAI is a member of the WEA and represents Israel there, even though the EAI does not really represent local believers in Israel. Since the WEA only accepts one alliance per country, the Arab Convention can only become a member as church network. I will pause here for a second so that we can have a look at the complete graph. The controversy described around evangelical raises some questions. How can you be evangelical and want to have a church which rather resembles a legal body exercising personal law? Why would you like to be part in a Zionist-dominated global movement which is against you? Then why do the Arab evangelicals call themselves evangelical at all? What do they mean by that? How is evangelical self-understanding expressed in this specific context, and what effect might this have on the perception of global evangelicalism? I will try to provide answers to these questions in the next two sections. I would like to begin by looking at the history and contemporary relevance of the understanding of religion and Christianity in Israel before outlining how evangelicals distinguish themselves from it and at the same time adopt some aspects. Today, the Muslim, Druze, Jewish, Baha'is, and 10 churches are officially recognized as religious communities in Israel. They are responsible for the administration of personal and family law. They also have some privileges, such as tax reliefs or special visa regulations. This jurisdiction is justified in contemporary Israeli politics as a continuation of British and as well as Ottoman policies, a continuation of the status quo. This view is also widely held by scholars and the general public. In contrast, however, a critical historical examination shows that there were significant innovations and transformations in both the British and Israeli administrations that brought about today's political dimension of religion and Christianity in Israel. In Ottoman times, the administration of non-Muslims, thus Jews and Christians, took place within the religious group, often understood as millet. Here, however, there was no exclusivity. Non-Muslims frequently sought general Ottoman courts as well. Also, until the 19th century, only 3 millets were recognized. Other non-Muslim groups were co-administered by them. Reforms in the 19th century brought about differentiation and led to a certain degree of systematization. But it was not until the British that membership in a religious community became the exclusive principle. For from British imperial administration on, the general Ottoman courts were declared Muslim courts, and the Muslim religious groups as millet was put on equal footing with the non-Muslim ones. Belonging to a religious group was now unavoidable. It led to legal uncertainty in many cases, especially for Christians, since the ecclesiastical courts were not subject to state supervision and often there were no corpora of laws. Rather, a kind of common law prevailed even today. The Israeli state continued this practice and made it its own. I would like to give a few examples. As early as the 1947-48 war and the state funding phase, the Arab population was divided along religious lines. We can speak of a system of divide and rule. Arab Jews became Jewish Israelis. Among the rest of the Arab population, a distinction was made between Muslims and Christians. Newly added was the category of Druze, whom the young Israeli state recognized as a new religious group and co-opted in a promise of privileges for the army. The creation of an Aramaic identity in 2014, a category accessible to Christians that has received high media attention in recent years, can also be seen in this context. Conflicts between religious groups, such as Christian Muslim or Christian Druze disputes, were politically intended. Religion not only has a legal, ethnic, and political dimension, but also has a profound social impact, as belonging to a certain religious group is understood as a family affair. These aspects of religion and Christianity are particularly evident in Nazareth. The various religious groups have their own neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and generate income by renting out their properties. Here we can see a map with the respective quarters from 1868. So we see the Latin quarter, meaning the Roman Catholic quarter, the Greek Orthodox quarter, and there was a Muslim quarter. And here we can see a map from 1914 with a list of the several institutions of the respective religious communities. So there was a Latin, Orthodox, Muslim, and Protestant quarter property. And these quarters and institutions exist in a similar manner until today. The Orthodox Council in particular is one of the most important political institutions in Nazareth because of its membership and property strength. This leads to the fact that many atheists of Orthodox belonging are politically active in the Orthodox Council and shape the understanding of Orthodoxy, Christianity, and religion. Evangelicals strongly distance themselves from the outlined understanding of religion and Christianity. At the same time, however, it becomes clear that this understanding is so dominant that they cannot completely distance themselves from it, but have to take up individual aspects of it. Based on the interviews I conducted with Orthodox, Catholic, and Evangelical Christians in Nazareth, I would like to outline 3 areas of this negotiation process. First, according to the understanding of Arab evangelicals, it is only faith in Jesus Christ, in his death and resurrection for the forgiveness of sin, that makes a person a Christian. The idea that family inheritance or membership in a particular religious community leads to a Christian existence is vehemently opposed. I would like to illustrate this confrontation with two quotations from the interviews I conducted. One evangelical said, for example, "I'm a Christian by choice. I want to be a Christian. I understand my Christianity now and I want to be Christian. That is the difference, not being born into Christianity. Choose Christ." And one Greek Orthodox said, "My family, my mom and my dad are Christians. When I was born, they took me to the church and baptized me, but I can't say that in my house I got religious education. When I'm married, I went to the church. When I will die, I will go to the church because of the religion is something that you cannot live without it, even if it's only at the paper. So I was born to a Christian family and then I'm Christian. If I was born to a Muslim family, I will be Muslim. But more than this, I'm an atheist." From this principle, being a Christian by faith alone, further evangelical principles arise, which are formulated in distinction to the dominant understanding of religion and Christianity. The church is a community, a place where faith is lived and the Bible is read, and not a socio-legal, institutionalized religious community. And we have seen that tension in a previous part when discussing the Arab Convention, Anglicans, and the EAI, and we have also seen that the Arab Evangelical Convention seeks recognition despite all evangelical claims. The Bible is the standard of faith, which must therefore be read accordingly, not church tradition. And we have seen this confrontation in the opening example of Palm Sunday. In the end, as some among the Arab evangelicals self-critically note, evangelicals established their own church traditions with processions like these. What now looks like a general evangelical parlance or jargon unfolds in this particular context truly critical potential. Faith transcends this worldly, political dimension of religion. Thus, a critique is made of the dominant understanding of religion and Christianity in Israel and its political, ethical, social dimensions. I will elaborate on this critical potential in the context of the second line of conflict, evangelical and the national identity, in the following part. A great day for Israel. This was tweeted by then US President Donald Trump on the occasion of the inauguration of the US Embassy in Jerusalem in 2018. The embassy inauguration marked a temporary zenith of the pro-Israel US foreign policy, which Trump also implemented as a favor to his mainly white evangelical voters. The relocation and inauguration of the embassy was supported by some leading US evangelicals, including Robert Jeffress and John Hagee. We see John Hagee here leading the closing prayer at the inauguration ceremony in Jerusalem. John Hagee is the author of many books on Israel with titles such as In Defense of Israel. In these books, he describes his apocalyptic end-time thinking. He sees the present state of Israel as the fulfillment of the biblical promises. In his opinion, the funding of the state of Israel and the return of the Jews are signs of the approaching end times. Wars culminate in the Battle of Armageddon and the destruction of Jerusalem and Israel. In his eyes, Palestine has never existed. Hagee sees it as a duty of Christians to support Israel. His organization, Christian United for Israel, has about 15 million members today, making it America's largest pro-Israel organization. With political achievements such as the embassy inauguration, John Hagee can prove that his theology is right and true. A brief side note, I know that John Hagee or Robert Jeffress do not represent the entire evangelical spectrum in the US, and that there are and have been critical views as well, but I want to present here the dominant voices from which Arab evangelicals then distinguish themselves. So, how do the Arab evangelicals relate to this? First of all, let's stick to the example of the embassy inauguration, an event that received a lot of attention in the media in Israel and around the world. There has been critique and rejection of John Hagee's view from Arab evangelicals, for example, from the Nazareth theologian Johanna Catanaccio, who rejects this Zionist view and describes the problem of Arab evangelicals as follows. Unfortunately, Arab evangelicals are located in the wrong team because of their ethnic identity. They are the political enemies of the state of Israel and consequently the enemies of God. What do they need to do in order to please the evangelical God? Should they abandon their homes, their history, their culture, and their call to serve their Muslim and Jewish neighbors? Should they betray their nation because being a Palestinian is by definition evil? There were some other statements from Arab evangelicals from Israel on the occasion of the embassy inauguration, but there is no overarching statement that is from the Evangelical Convention or Nazareth Evangelical College or congregations and so on. And this is in line with the rest of my research findings. Occasionally, Arab evangelicals want to talk about the subject of Israel, especially those with an Israel critical stance. But most of them try to avoid talking about the entire issue, often explicitly referring to it as the issue. It is like an elephant in the room. Silence reigns, therefore I have left this slide blank. Even in sermons, church services, or other gatherings, the issue is not discussed. Silence reigns. All they want to talk about is faith, faith, faith. And here I would like to follow up on the previous section. The emphasis on faith is not only an identity marker in differentiation from traditional Christians and a critique of the politicization of religion, but faith is above all also transcendence and critique of the conflict over Israel. I would like to clarify this in the following drawing on the example of the House of Prayer and Exploits, short HOPE, in Nazareth. I would first like to contextualize HOPE. HOPE is part of the worldwide prayer movement with its center in Kansas City. So the House of Prayer there is called IHOP-KC, led by Mike Bickle. The prayer movement is charismatic Pentecostal in its orientation and characterized by the idea of spiritual warfare. There's a strong eschatological focus. Underlying this is a dualistic view of the kingdom of God that is fighting against the kingdom of Satan. Unlike classical dispensationalism, Mike Bickle does not assume that there will be a rapture, but that the church will stand by Jesus' side as his bride. Israel plays an important role in this conception. There's the Israel mandate, as we can see on their website. For bringing about the end times, it is central to convert the Jews. They have a special prayer times for Israel, and we can see that IHOP-KC is in contact with 4 Messianic houses of prayer in Israel, but not with the Arab HOPE in Nazareth. Because of this network, the HOPE in Nazareth is considered Zionist among Arab evangelicals. When one enters the HOPE in Nazareth, one initially has the impression that this accusation is justified. For example, inside we find a picture like this one, where we see the US and Israeli flags, a bride symbolizing the church, and so on. But at the Friday prayer meetings, which attract about 30 young people, these items get no attention. For example, if flags are waved during worship, which is a common practice in gatherings of the prayer movement, they are white flags. The focus is on worshiping God, or the practice of praying in tongues, and even exorcisms take place. Israel is not discussed, but if it is, the prayer group uses inclusive wording such as, "We pray for peace in our country." In the following, I would like to elaborate on this position based on an interview with a leading member of HOPE. I will name her Carol. The reason for her involvement in HOPE is that she wants to avoid the identity conflict through the supernatural experience. She describes her identity conflict in the following way. We just can't say that we are Palestinians, because we are not. Because the Palestinian community in the West Bank doesn't consider us Palestinian, and we don't say that we are Israeli, because Israelis don't consider us as Israeli. I cannot say that I'm not Palestinian. I'm Palestinian Israeli. If you ask me, I would say I'm from the Holy Land. To avoid all, when I'm asked around the world where I'm from, I say I'm from Nazareth or from the Holy Land. I don't take a stand of Israel-Palestine. I think there's no other identity crisis in the world except of here. That's why in the churches, there's more focus on our heavenly identity, that you just don't get into politics. We say our identity is heavenly. So she uses wordings like Holy Land and Nazareth to avoid a standpoint and sets her focus on heavenly identity. She distances herself from pictures like the one we just saw by saying, "It's a gift from many nations to the house of prayer here." She wishes that Israel would not be an issue in the churches and at HOPE. When I first went to the house of prayer, I saw the Israeli flag and the American flag, and I was like, what's going on? You know, we are not used to that, and I didn't like it. I thought that it would bring deception to others, and a few youth who went there had the same idea of like, oh, that's an Israeli place, the Zionist place. Now they are part of the house of prayer because at some point the Lord just breaks every, differences. I'm always sharing with people that it doesn't have to be our issue. And it's dividing us as a church. There are a lot of divisions because of the issue of the land. And as a youth leader, I just don't want to be there. And I always say that we don't have to go into that. And we need to focus on Jesus. And I don't think that wasting time and arguing about it is really helpful. Like, look around us. Many people are going to hell, and we are trying to be right or wrong about this land or that land. The reason for her being at Hope is the supernatural experience. Just leaving everything aside and trying to shut my mind down to have something that is abnormal, not from my mind. And then allow my mind to just paying or receive the thoughts of that is not mine, to be open to the supernatural. So how can we interpret these statements? I do not think that this focus on the supernatural experience is to be understood as a passive escape from the world or as an apolitical piety. I suggest interpreting it as an active critique of this conflict, transcending it. Heavenly identity or even the prayer in tongues are visible expressions of this. By focusing on faith in Jesus Christ and inner spirituality, Arab evangelicals are emphasizing one, if not the, evangelical core tenet. In doing so, they also criticize the Zionist orientation in global evangelicalism. Let me explicate this thought in the conclusion. We have considered the complex and conflictive identity of Arab evangelicals. The different levels of identity are in conflict with each other, while there are mainly two lines of tension. The conflict between evangelical and the dominant understanding of religion and Christianity in Israel on the one hand, and the conflict between evangelical and the national self-understanding, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli on the other. We have seen the dominant understanding of religion and theological debates around Israel that are not mere discourses of languages, but have material impact and determine the identity of Arab evangelicals in Israel. I understand these discourses as historical and cultural structures within which the Arab evangelicals negotiate their identity and have agency. In these conflicts, Arab evangelicals are facing limitations. It seems virtually impossible to them to take an appropriate position. Thus, one Arab evangelical from Nazareth said, "Whatever we do, someone will not be happy." In the starting example of the boy and the donkey, we saw that too. Some took offense at the fact that the class reenacted Palm Sunday at all. Others might have taken offense if Palm Sunday as a Christian holiday had not been addressed at all. Others might have taken offense at the Palestinian kufiyya, and so on. The strategy of evangelicals is to place faith in Jesus Christ with their intense piety at the center. Their identity is a heavenly one. In this way, Arab evangelicals try to transcend and also criticize the present world, the dominant politicized understanding of religion, and the conflict in and around Israel. In doing so, they also take a subversive position within global evangelicalism as an independent, but marginalized and often unheard evangelical voice. I would like to end with this statement. Thank you for your attention. I'm now looking forward to your feedback, questions, and our discussion.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was a fascinating paper and a really insightful overview of the situation, the political situation in the region.